keynote lecture of this conference. Our keynote speaker for this session is Dr. Peter Altmann. He recently became the David Allen Hubbard Associate Professor of Old Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary. He has a doctorate in biblical studies from Princeton Theological Seminary on the topic of Festive Meals in Ancient Israel, Deuteronomy's identity politics in their ancient Near Eastern context, and has had a post-doctoral researcher post at the University of Zurich, where he focused primarily on issues of economics, food, and the reception of law in ancient Israel and early Judaism. His publications include the monographs Banned Birds, the Birds of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, and Economics in Persian-Period Biblical Texts. And it's on the subject of birds that he's going to be speaking to us this afternoon in his talk, Learning from the Crows, Worship and Wisdom with the Birds in the Hebrew Bible. Peter, thank you for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you with us to give this talk.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And first of all, I want to say thanks to the organizers of this conference. I think it's a very exciting topic. And thanks as well in advance to all of you watching and listening for your willingness to endure a circa 60-minute lecture per video link. I know that an hour-long lecture can be taxing enough in person. And so I appreciate your additional effort to put up with me also at what's near the end of your day. I consider it a great honor to participate in this broad interdisciplinary conversation of religious studies with the natural sciences. I would like to situate myself in this discussion in order, perhaps in part, to temper your expectations for my lecture and also to provide you with some sense of my approach. As an Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar, trained in the classical methods of biblical studies in the United States and in German-speaking scholarship, my educational journey has prepared me to interpret these scriptural texts first and foremost in relation to their ancient cultural, linguistic, material, and religious settings. However, as many of you are surely aware, at least in the last generation of biblical scholars, they've also following broader changes in the humanities, began to take explicit interest in the questions that readers, that is, you and I, bring to these texts. In line with this development, in this lecture, I both want to draw on my training in the classical methodologies of critical biblical scholarship while also risking consideration of how the pressing questions of the relationship between science and animals in the religious spheres of our 21st century world might make an opening for new insights from these texts. I'll venture to stick out at least my little toe to see what happens when a biblical scholar steps into the contested space of science and religion in and perhaps even beyond the modern West. So let me begin first here by giving you a sense of where my lecture is headed. An outline. As you can see, I'll begin with some more words of introduction, then turn to a topic that's familiar to me from my earlier studies in consumption and dietary prohibition of birds. Third, I'll consider an angle that's often overlooked, which is flyers as fantastic creatures. From there, I'll begin investigating what can arise from applying recent turns in animal studies to the questions and texts of the Hebrew Bible, namely birds as creatures beyond human valuation. Fifth, and finally, I'll turn to the main event of my paper, Crows and Ravens, Divine Service to Ostracization. I'll finish with a few summarizing words in conclusion. So with those words of orientation behind me, I'll now turn to situate my investigation within biblical studies. So I see biblical studies standing in a kind of reciprocal relationship with the worlds of their composers. That is, the texts typically refract rather than mirror the composer's worlds. To be more specific, the texts interact with, respond to, and influence those worlds in which the composers and audiences lived, but they do so through cultured lenses. That is, their theology, politics, gender, economics, material, environmental, geographic, and other factors. And in view of my topic today, learning from the birds in biblical texts, I find it important to mention one more hermeneutical circle as a kind of personal confession. When it comes to the non-human animals that serve as a topic for my discussion, I relate to them first and foremost as a student of texts. My now budding interest in birds has taken root because they appear in the biblical and other ancient texts. As tragic as one may find this confession, and now I want to provide you with a bit of hope, investigating birds in the text has also enlightened me to the reality of birds outside the text, both in my surroundings and the surroundings of the composers of the ancient texts that I study. In any case, this generative news site now circles back to inform how I read the biblical text. I expect that many of you may be more like my wife, a diehard animal lover, whose interactions with animals begin at a different place in this reciprocal relationship. Her interests in the realia of the non-anthropological world gave rise at some point to questions of how this external world fits with the concerns of religion, worldview, and faith that at some point bubbled to the surface in her consciousness. Regardless of your starting point, my hope is that my biblical reflections can add another layer of intrigue, respect, and care for the creatures and world that we already value as part of an ongoing virtuous cycle. So for an entertaining opening on the triangular relationship between God, humans, and non-human animals in the Hebrew Bible that can soften us to their insight and guidance, I begin with a short overview of the parade example of animals instructing humans in the Bible. That is the story of Balaam and his donkey, or more correctly, his jenny, in Numbers 22. Balaam features in the Hebrew Bible as a non-Israelite prophet or seer hired by one of Israel's enemies, Balak, king of the Moabites, to curse Israel on Balak's behalf. According to the received form of this story, Balaam sets out to meet with Balak with less than God's full-throated endorsement and divine ambivalence crescendos. A divine messenger stands in Balaam and his beast of burden's way as they ride to meet Balak. While the seer, ironically, cannot see the divine messenger, his jenny can. She therefore veers off course or refuses to press forward to what would have been Balaam's death, as stated in no uncertain terms in Numbers 22:33. She thereby protects the blind seer. Such maneuvering takes place 3 times, and Balaam, totally unaware of the threat to his life, becomes so incensed with his jenny that he beats her. The climax of the story is reached when the Lord gives the jenny human speech. In the ensuing discussion, Balaam comes to recognize his jenny's ongoing loyalty to him, which should have led him to trust her wisdom in this situation as well. The story itself does not provide any signals that it must concern a fable, though this option appears very attractive to modern readers. In any case, the narrative concludes with the Lord opening Balaam's eyes so that he can see the divine messenger's presence. The messenger subsequently explains the situation and Balaam's failings to him. Balaam makes final declaration of his sin and a commitment of obedience to God. Among the many outcomes of this story, one can naturally pose the ironic question, who is the real dumb animal? Yet building further on this entertaining question, the audience is invited to consider how non-human animal eyes may be open to divine and other realities in ways that humans' eyes are not. This line of exploration might result in humans humbling themselves to learn from their fellow earth dwellers. In the following discussion, I take up this invitation with regard to birds, and especially the family of the corvids, which includes crows and ravens. So why birds, you might ask? So I begin with this rather basic question. Why, or perhaps how, do birds matter in biblical texts? There are several ways to answer this question. Most fundamentally, they matter because they existed in the world of the ancient Israelite and early Judean communities responsible for the composition of the texts that have become the Hebrew Bible, Jewish Tanakh, and Christian Old Testament. Birds, therefore, comprised an object that was ripe for reflection within the community of its composers. As my former Zurich colleague, Anna Angelini, writes with regard to animals in general, following anthropologists Claude Lévi-Strauss, Stanley Tambia, and Dan Sperber, animals are notoriously good to think. This means that they can activate a high number of cultural representations, while at the same time remaining cognitively simple and intuitive tools. In other words, at least for the ancients, animals could take on a number of meanings or types of significance. They constitute malleable symbols. I expect that such instrumentalization of animals could cause for some pause among reflective modern persons attuned to abuse of animals. Given the laudable intent to have animals matter as subjects and not merely as objects of human thought and action. This critique does have some justification, but animals have other functions as well. More specificity can be articulated with regard to the birds, a designation I will use in this paper interchangeably with the perhaps slightly more appropriate term flyers as a catch-all, given that the biblical category includes bats and can include locusts. For one, these creatures occupy, at least some of the time, the literal space that the ancients imagined to have existed between themselves and their god or gods. The air, or often in ancient languages, the heavens. From this perspective, flyers exist between the divine sphere and the sphere of created things. As such, ancient cultures viewed them as offering heightened potential because they could serve as intermediaries between those spheres. As a category I will explore below, as an overarching roadmap, humans encounter flyers in the Hebrew Bible in a great variety of ways, some of which I've listed here, as potential food, valued created beings, messengers from God, examples of the laudable desire for proximity to the divine presence, and finally, praiseworthy creatures that trust in divine provision. With this diversity of topics in mind, I intend to show depictions of animals in the biblical texts include but go beyond the nature-culture dichotomy at the heart of modern Western scientific divide between humans and other animals. Specifically, I intend to show how reassessing the value placed on non-animal human wisdom can enhance an important source of learning in the study of religion and science. Hopefully, as a result of my remarks, our intrigue in avian wisdom will increase. So according to the biblical narrative, after the flood, humans receive permission to eat every kind of animal in Genesis 9:3. To a certain degree, God thereby proclaims all animals good for food. This narrative development also includes a change in animals' attitudes towards humans. They become fearful. The text does not explicitly tell us what the basic tenor of animals' view of humans had previously been, though Noah was able to bring them onto the ark, which likely indicates some level of cooperation. Such mythical collaboration and an accompanying vegetarianism or veganism, which also appears in Isaiah 11, negate both the everyday world of ancient Israel and our own. Regular Israelites, as well as Mesopotamian and Egyptian realities, included considerable hunting and some raising of captive flocks for consumption by human populations and by their deities. In this broader context, several verses in the biblical books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy repeat almost identical lists of flyers that the community of Israel should avoid. The Hebrew terms for these prohibited creatures pose daunting philological problems for those attempting to ascertain their identities. Even if scholars have succeeded in large part in seeing the excluded animals as consisting of various types of eagles, vultures, owls, bats, and some aquatic birds, among others, interpreters continue to wrestle, adding to the ink spilled over the millennia, in attempts to pinpoint reason or reasons for distinguishing between animals acceptable and prohibited for Israelite consumption. A simple or straightforward answer has yet to arise. Read in their immediate literary context, this repeated list of prohibitions does not concern categories of edible or physically healthy foods. Few people probably endeavored to consume falcon or hawk in antiquity, though exceptions do appear in the textual record. Ostriches may be one of the creatures on the banned list, and they were definitely consumed, then as now. There is some evidence of consumption of other animals on the list as well, though the case is weaker for the flyers than it is for some banned aquatic animals such as catfish and shark. Another theory popular in scholarship is that birds were prohibited on the basis of their diets. Carrion-eating and carnivorous birds were excluded. While this holds true to an extent, it does not explain the exclusion of the ostrich or the acceptability of ducks. In addition to vegetation, just taking ducks as an example, they eat insects, amphibians, and other aquatic animals. Though the communities behind biblical texts may not have understood these animals as having blood per se, and thus not within their category of animal. However, to my knowledge, the diet of ducks does not diverge significantly from cormorants, which were excluded. And so basically every criterion put forward does not hold once one gets into the details. Thus, my contention is that there is no simple answer that explains the prohibition of every type of bird mentioned. Rather, on the most basic level of the text, abstention from the various animals intends to mark those following the prohibitions as separate to Israel's God, or in the terms of the text as I put here from Deuteronomy 14, as holy. However, given the relatively non-authoritative nature of this repeated list into what's known as the Hellenistic period from the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE among Judean communities, again, especially for the aquatic creatures, but likely also for the birds, one may wonder again about the importance of these textual prohibitions for concrete community practices. Given the mostly unnecessary prohibition on, for example, eagles, yet disregard for the prohibition on scaleless sharks, how can these texts provide instruction for interested audiences? Sorry to disappoint you, but I will leave this question unanswered for today. The example of consumption and dietary prohibitions marks an especially instrumentalizing approach to animals. The communities behind the text of the Hebrew Bible imagine birds largely fit or not for human consumption, and in some case for divine offering. In the latter capacity, they serve as both metaphorical divine food and as cleansing agents. Furthermore, as I have just demonstrated, the prohibited types serve as instruments for human theorizing. That is, birds signify and symbolize values and concerns beyond themselves. As the subsequent sections will show, the value of birds was fraught with a considerable variety of concerns, such that eating them was never just for the belly, but played a part, as did all interactions with them, in a person's and a society's theological and ethical formation. As stated here in Deuteronomy 14, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. In other words, in the communities that took these texts as scriptural, that is, as authoritative or inspirational, adherence to the mandate of the text expressed their loyalty to their deity. Now to turn to a very different concern. The first step towards complexity and a more complete view of birds can come by turning our attention to a set of fantastic creatures that occupy space between God and humans in both broader ancient Near East and in the biblical texts themselves. Ancient Near Eastern scholar Annie Kabe makes the pertinent observation about the iconography of animals that clear distinctions between real and invented animals do not occur. I make note of her remark for two reasons. First, it underscores that ancients did not necessarily divide the reality they experienced into the same categories that modern Westerners do. This insight means that understanding ancient texts requires putting on a different set of glasses in relation to one's perspective on the, quote, real with regard to the non-human animal world. I've already noted as much in my earlier discussion of Balaam. Comparative evidence of such a lack of distinctions comes from some indigenous cultures today as well. They can assume that non-human animals have similar minds and cultures to humans. Philippe Descola has helped me begin to comprehend this different way of approaching reality, which may ascribe interiority to non-humans. Beyond Descola's ethnographic and anthropological reflections, however, I found myself somewhat surprised to hear University of Washington in Seattle wildlife scientist John Marsluff attributing features such as interiority to corvids as well, including features such as mental time travel or a theory of mind. This convergence has opened the door for me to consider the category of non-human animals differently, including those I would call fantastic creatures in the graphic and textual representations of the world of ancient Israel. Investigation into these creatures might provide us modern Westerners with valuable insight. Those called cherubim and seraphim in Hebrew are closely related to the lamassu in Mesopotamia. Cultures throughout the ancient Fertile Crescent imagined and formed figures that guarded the holy realms occupied by their deities. Readers of the biblical text know them from Isaiah 6, which relates Isaiah's temple vision in which he receives his prophetic call. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings, with 2 covering their faces, and 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots and the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? These awesome creatures can cause the monumental Jerusalem temple to shake through the thundering of their voices. They act as attendants or servants in God's throne room. In this setting, one of them also plays the role of a purifying intermediary, preparing Isaiah to hear the divine voice and receive his mission. Cultures throughout the ancient Near East envisioned and carved such creatures to guard the thresholds between the mundane and sacred spheres. Prominent examples of such lamassus from the Neo-Assyrian palaces of the 9th through 7th centuries BCE are displayed, as you probably know better than I do, in the British Museum. As is well known, a cherubim takes up a similar task in Genesis 3:24 on the boundary of the Garden of Eden. In this case, of course, making sure that humans no longer enter. A similar and intriguing perspective emerges from the Mesopotamian iconography that depicts the wisdom of the ancients coming through apkalus, which were mythical creatures with human heads and bird or fish-like bodies or garments, or as portrayed here, the reverse, here with a bird head. One can understand these creatures as accessing divine wisdom in part because of their mixture between human and non-human animal features. So just as in the worlds of Harry Potter or Tolkien's Middle-earth, which have their centaurs, the ancients conceived of mixed creatures that, as a result of their combination, were able to tap into a variety of wisdoms, both human and non-human. Pertinent to my topic, many of them possessed wings. While these creatures find little space in our modern scientific investigations of the world, I bring them to our attention in order to note that their bird-like attributes contributed to the ancient conception of their roles as divine intermediaries. This understanding also builds on the notion mentioned above that flyers inhabit the space between humans on earth and deities in the heavens. The same is the case for fish-like mixtures, where some wisdom comes from the depths. So I would be amiss if I did not set my discussion of the birds within another broad category, which is God's general concern for the created world. As the basis for much, or as from Susanna's lecture yesterday, perhaps too much theological animal ethics, I will only provide some general statements. The first, of course, being the most well-known text of Genesis 1, where God's view of creation is good. The general statement. And God saw that it was good in Genesis 1:21 and 25 for animals. The importance of this declaration and the discussion of non-human animals in the text I mentioned next are that these creatures are accorded value outside the mention of any usefulness for humans. So we see this as well in Psalm 104, which is widely understood to represent a case of borrowing from the Egyptian hymn to Aten, the Egyptian sun god. This psalm paints a picture of everyday divine care for vegetation, non-humans, and also human creatures. God provides for wild land animals, birds, and domesticated cattle. This care consists of food, drink, appropriate shelter, regular rhythms of time and seasons, and even other important products. This psalm recognizes birds, especially in relation to their place of shelter among the trees. Now, there is one more psalm, Psalm 84, that conceives of birds as exceptionally close to God's presence and as exemplary worshipers. This psalm picks up on the solar imagery for God that also underlies Psalm 104. This point is important because it draws upon the fundamental provision that God offers to the entire world. However, in Psalm 84, the focus is on God's intense presence in the Jerusalem temple. After proclaiming the special nature of God's dwelling and the psalmist's desire to be there, verses 4-5, or here in the English translation, verses 3-4, describes the birds, especially the sparrow and swallow, that even take up residence in the Lord's own earthly home. Even the sparrow finds a home and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young at your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Happy are those who live in your house, ever singing your praise. Here, the birds embody the proximity to the deity that the psalmist desires. Furthermore, the birds repetitively sing praises to the Lord. In this capacity, the birds are preeminent worshipers. They demonstrate the appropriate hope for pilgrims who come to the temple in the verses that follow. There's also an element of realism here. One can call to mind the nests of various birds in the exterior, or sometimes even the interior nooks and crannies of large places of worship today to imagine how small birds found similar refuge in the Jerusalem temple building. Again, with the seraphim in Isaiah 6 and the ancient Near Eastern lamassu in mind, yet another interpretive pathway opens up. Perhaps there is an ironic play on those semi-divine protectors here in Psalm 84. Rather than requiring protection by powerful gatekeepers such as mythical creatures, God is sufficiently secure to welcome relatively weak birds like the swallow into the holiest of places. Turning closer to the creatures in the title of my paper, while Psalm 104 and 84 do not single out crows or ravens, Psalm 147 and Job 38, investigated yesterday in depth, do. In Job 38:41, after a long litany of rhetorical questions demonstrating God's superiority in relation to cosmological and weather phenomenon, we see God's provision for non-human animals, as we saw yesterday, specifically lions and corvids, and especially their young. Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their coverts? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food? So I wonder, why name these two types of animals? I suspect that they represent traits admired by the text composers. As we saw yesterday, the strength and ferocity in the case of the lion, that I would suggest cleverness and ingenuity in the case of the corvids. These texts focus, however, on their young in order to highlight situations in which even these types of animals require protection and provision. Also striking in Job 38, like Psalm 104, is the relative or complete omission of humans. Humans receive divine care at the same level of other creatures in Psalm 104, where they only appear in 2 verses. As discussed yesterday in depth, humans do not appear at all as part of the content in Job 38 and following. When we turn to Psalm 147, it picks up on the same image of the young corvids crying for food in verse 9. Praise the Lord, how good it is to sing praise to our God, for he is gracious and a song of praise is fitting. The Lord builds up Jerusalem, he gathers the outcasts of Israel, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Skipping down to verse 6, the Lord lifts up the downtrodden, he casts the wicked to the ground. Sing to the Lord with thanksgiving, make melody to our God on the lyre. He gives to the animals their food, the young ravens when they cry. His delight is not in the strength of the horse, nor in his pleasure in the speed of the runner. But the Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, in those who hope in his steadfast love. So God's provision of food for the animals here in verse 9 serves a different rhetorical purpose. In this context, it functions as a guidepost for human ethics. It is grounded in God's care for justice, especially for those in dire need, as we see in verses 2 through 3 and 6, who in this psalm are Jerusalem and its outcast children. So I have marked them all in bold. Just as God demonstrates divine care for the non-human world, God will also restore the oppressed and upend the wicked. Therefore, one should live in awe and respect for God, marked in red. And rather than relying on one's own strength, speed, or other abilities or accomplishments, which are struck through in the text, one should praise and call out to God as the young ravens do, also marked in red. Here, the action of these birds is expressed with the Hebrew term kara. Its basic meaning concerns to call or cry out. In relation to God, it can mean call for help, which is the primary meaning here. However, it also appears in conjunction with giving praise or worship. Thus, the action taken by the young corvids in connection with the actions taken by other creatures that rely on the deity offer human audiences an excellent example of reliance upon the deity in connection to worship. So this section has begun with a broad theological statement of Genesis 1. It's continued to narrow the scope to God's care for birds, including young, vulnerable corvids, which surprisingly appear twice as the objects of divine compassion. Given the value of such animals outside of human-dominated spheres, these scriptures indicate that humans should follow the lead given by these animals' wise responses to and reliance on the deity. Humans should similarly trust in divine provision and perform justice. So now, after considering the role of birds and animals more generally, the roles that they can play in the unfolding of the biblical story, I'd like to trace in more depth the depictions of these dark or black birds as they are described in Song of Songs 5:11. They are generally rendered as ravens or crows in English Bible, but no distinction between them is provided in the biblical text. Given the description in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, which is that every black bird, and orev is the word in Hebrew, according to its kind, I find it appropriate to render the term as a family distinction for corvidae or corvids. On the basis of their distribution, the species best known in the ancient Levant was likely the brown-necked raven, Corvus ruficollis. Its head and neck have a brownish hue, giving rise to its English name. However, the fan-tailed raven, the Corvus rupidurus, among others, also inhabited the region. Please note that I am here equivocating on the term crows in my title. Crows happen to be the corvids that I see most often outside of my window, so it sounded most natural to me, though perhaps I ought to have chosen ravens to keep in line with the species most present in the ancient Levant. So if we begin beyond the initial mentions above in Job and the Psalms, an investigation of their place in the biblical conceptions involves connections with rain or lack thereof, and it comprises a move from prized to an impure creature. I'd like to begin with one of the most well-known and long-traveled stories, that of Noah and the raven in Genesis 8:7. So the story goes as follows in Genesis 8:6 through 12. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out the raven, and it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent out the dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground, but the dove found no place to set its foot. And it returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it into the ark with him. Waited another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him anymore. An early rabbinic interpretation, often accepted today, views the raven negatively because it did not return to the ark. However, I would suggest that one may be better served by turning back to an earlier Mesopotamian version of the story. While there are various versions of the flood tradition, the extant lines appear only in the story of Gilgamesh. When the boat of the Mesopotamian Noah, known as Utnapishtim, comes to rest on a mountain, he releases a dove that returns, as does the swallow, because they did not find a place to land. After sending these two birds, he then sends a raven. I brought out a raven, I let it loose. Off went the raven. It saw the waters receding. Finding food, bowing and bobbing, it did not come back to me. Several observations indicate that the narrative honors the corvid. First, the raven successfully finds food and does not return to the boat while the others fail. The raven thereby demonstrates its resourcefulness and thus its superiority in this regard. Second, unlike the biblical narrative, in Gilgamesh, the raven is sent out last rather than first, which has a crescendo effect. Moving back to the version in Genesis 8, interpreting the change by the biblical authors is more tenuous. However, the biblical version may suggest again just how competent the composers viewed the raven. It accentuates the corvid's ability to exist in environments where the dove and the human could not. For our purposes, the importance of the birds, and especially the ravens in these stories, lies in their ability to serve as bearers of practical wisdom for humans. Noah and Utnapishtim rely on the ravens to demonstrate for the humans that life on dry land has again become sustainable. Corvids are the trailblazers or something of an ancient Wall-E from the 2008 Disney movie. Pardon the somewhat superficial connection. Further significance of the relationship emerges when reading the flood story in light of the divine human mediatory function of winged creatures. On this level, the raven not only indicates that the waters have receded, but also that God's wrath has been quelled. One might consider the relationship between human and bird instrumentalized here, but I suggest that it contains considerable reciprocity, perhaps even mutual trust and respect. Noah cares for the raven by bringing it and the other animals aboard. The raven returns the favor by demonstrating the viability of life on the newly dried lands. However, there are some judgment associations, and in addition to this ancient Near Eastern tradition, two biblical texts, in fact, may put the corvids in a somewhat negative light: Isaiah 34:11 and Proverbs 30:17. The first passage places corvids in the midst of desert ruins as part of a prophetic judgment oracle against Edom. They appear alongside other creatures that frequent such places. The owl or pelican and the hedgehog or owl will possess it, and owl or hawk and corvid will dwell in it. And he will stretch out the line of confusion and the stones of chaos over it. My translation here intends to highlight the uncertainties with regard to the identifications of several animals. In any case, the text imagines devastated enemy territory. Edom becomes the haunt of fantastic creatures, later in verse 14, such as goat demons and Lilith. The creatures reside in these places may not necessarily be evil, but they do take on negative hues through their association with ruins. They are creatures that thrive where humans no longer do. Human bane is their boon. A further dismal association for corvids comes to light in Proverbs 30:17. The eye that mocks a father and scorns to obey a mother, ravens of the valley will peck it out, and children of vultures or eagles will eat it. Here, corvids stand parallel to vultures or eagles, and these birds perform a gruesome task of judgment against a contemptuous child. In short, the eye that looks with scorn, the birds will peck out. The image intends to function as a powerful warning against such behavior, yet this does not mean that the birds receive only a negative evaluation. They enforce the desirable order of the world in which children should respect and honor their parents. Thus, the birds may know something about the divine order that unruly children ignore to their peril. Like the case of Noah, there is a kind of wisdom that humans can acquire by observing the actions of these animals. Nonetheless, this task of destruction does carry with it a gloom associated with some flyers that are also found in the Pentateuch's dietary prohibitions. So with this background in mind, I turn now to what I consider an underappreciated narrative in the book of 1 Kings that belongs to the story of the prophet Elijah that's found in chapters 17 through 19. This prophet is famous for his confrontation with Israel's King Ahab and Queen Jezebel that leads to a 3-year drought. At the end of these years, Elijah goes on to challenge the prophets of Baal, a widespread Levantine storm deity, to a contest to see whether Baal or the Lord could bring rain to end the suffocating drought. My text comes from the beginning of this narrative cycle. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word." The word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Go from here and turn eastward, and hide yourself in the Wadi Charit, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the wadi, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the Wadi Charit, which is east of the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the wadi. At the beginning of this narrative cycle, immediately after Elijah declares to Ahab that drought will come for several years, the prophet follows God's command to flee beyond Ahab's reach to the regions of the Jordan River. God states that he will provide for Elijah, sustenance for Elijah there. The fact that Elijah is to drink water from the Wadi Charit and not from the Jordan River may point to divine intervention that maintains the flow of water in this seasonal stream, at least for a while, despite the drought conditions. However, even more striking is that God commands ravens to feed him. There is a certain parallelism to God's provision for the Israelites in the desert from Exodus 16, but in the Exodus story, the meat is birds rather than being brought by birds. And of course, the birds there are quail rather than corvids. Thus, there are significant differences that call for investigation. Why is it that God specifically commands corvids to feed Elijah while he is in hiding? Furthermore, verse 6, the text states that Elijah's meals consisted of bread and meat. These were not the rations eaten in antiquity by those on the brink of starvation, for meat was not regularly consumed by non-elites. In other words, God practically provides Elijah with the menu of a feast, though the wine is missing. What is the significance of having ravens bring these dishes? It is not by chance that corvids are the birds of choice in this narrative for several reasons. First, Elijah hides in a fairly remote region. And as I've discussed in Isaiah 34, ravens were viewed by ancient Israelites as one of the types of birds that might be found in such desolate locations. Second, recent scientific studies have confirmed age-old observations of corvids' intelligence. A number of experiments indicate their ability for some abstract thought and social learning. Their brain sizes as a percentage of their mass equals those of mammals, providing a neurological explanation for their abilities. A gap in the narrative concerns the origins of the bread and meat acquired by the corvids. These birds have a long reputation as clever hunters and scavengers. For example, they were known and disdained for stealing offering meat from altars in ancient Greece. In modern times, they have been observed herding a flock of doves into traffic and then feasting on the resulting roadkill. More importantly, the birds are known to cache some of their food for later. One might add many more stories, but the point is that corvids innovate based on the circumstances and plan for lean times. In Elijah's case, one can note that it does not state what kind of meat they brought him. In any case, corvids serve as an appropriate creature for taking care of the prophet. A further set of questions might also arise from the narrative when read in light of modern scientific study. What kind of relationship develops between the birds and the prophet? Corvids as human pets are a widely documented phenomenon, even though it has become illegal in some countries. Charles Dickens' pet raven named Grip inspired an important character in his Barnaby Rudge. They also recognize faces and respond accordingly to those they have labeled as friend or foe. Given their recognition capabilities, the narrative intimates that they come to view Elijah as a friendly face. As a result, this short narrative provides an example of non-human and human collaboration. With regard to the bread, while in Hebrew it is also the general term for food, if it does indicate a manufactured product, then it suggests that the birds stole it from a human source. If so, then this stealing takes place at a moment of widespread hunger, which raises the ethical stakes. However, sociological studies of famine support speculation that while some people were going hungry, others, probably elites, still had plenty. Therefore, one can place the corvids in the category depicted in Proverbs 6:30, which reads, "A thief is not despised if he steals to fill his appetite when hungry." Turning to a final important development in the narrative, one can surmise that the corvids either hunted fresh meat or simply brought some out from the many caches that they had lain aside for meager times. Given the drought conditions, these birds also serve as a non-human example for the desired behavior in the immediately following story of the widow of Zarephath, whom Elijah begs for water and bread. She must take the risk of trusting the prophet's promise that sharing with him would ensure her survival and that of her son, both of whom were on the brink of starvation. So he, that being Elijah, set out and went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink." As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." But she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth." While the faith demonstrated in the Lord Elijah's God by this foreign woman from Baal's home territory has often and rightfully received notice, I argue that her exemplary action is in fact previewed in the corvids' sharing of their provisions. Thus, the corvids paved the way of faith in Israel's God that humans are to follow. So I want to address one more level of ambivalence in the Hebrew Bible's view of corvids, returning full circle to the dietary prohibitions with an eye on the raven or crow adds another wrinkle to this investigation. Study of ancient Greek versions of Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 reveal that the earliest manuscripts of the Greek tradition, which was translated from Hebrew manuscripts of these biblical books in 3rd century BCE Egypt, did not prohibit these birds. Rather, the ban on the corvids only came as Greek culture increased its influence in Judean communities in both the Levant and Egypt. What might have led to this addition of the corvids to the list of prohibited birds? So a plausible answer to this question emerges from the study of classical Greek traditions about ravens, karakos in Greek, which are quite negative. They feature regularly as a part of curses. These birds are imagined to gloat over corpses, and as I've already mentioned, they reportedly stole meat offered on altars, and they are generally an image of ruin. The several examples provide the flavor of Greek associations with these birds. First, in Aeschylus's play, Agamemnon from the early 5th century, a raven is used to express a kind of look. Standing over the corpus in the manner of a loathsome raven, it glories in tunelessly singing a song of joy. Similarly, the 6th century poet Theognis has a negative view. The English translation, this is quite intriguing. In English, it reads, "Everything here has gone to the dogs and to ruin." However, if you look back at the Greek, rather than "to the dogs," the Greek text literally reads, "to the crows." Thus, something going to the crows or to the ravens indicates that it is in very poor shape. Aristophanes, the Attic playwright known as the father of comedy from the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, mentions ravens a number of times. In his play Clouds, the raven appears, as it frequently does, as part of a curse. "Buzz off to the blazes" is the English translation. Literally mean the literal is throw to the ravens, who's been pounding on my door. In other words, there's a curse that's spoken here. While there are several others, somewhat less imprecatory uses of ravens in ancient Greek literature, this is the general flavor. They were birds associated with destruction, death, unworthiness, low quality, and the stuff of curses. As a result, it appears that the biblical text of the dietary laws originally did not prohibit these black birds, but they grow to include them due to the disdain for them in Greek culture. While outside of my immediate expertise, I would like to close by leaning into one New Testament reference to ravens because it provides a sense of completeness to my discussion. The Gospel of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount contains the famous exhortation to consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air that do not sow or reap, and yet the Heavenly Father feeds them. Luke's version of the text, here in 1224, though perhaps less known, makes the identification of the birds more explicit. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouses nor barn, and yet God feeds them. How much more value are you than the birds? If one does consider the ravens, while they have neither storehouse nor barn, they certainly do find ways to employ their proportionately large brains to plan, kill, gather, and cache food for lean times. Given their increasingly recognized behavioral similarities in these and other ways to humans, they do serve as apt guides for human responsiveness to God with trusting loyalty. What proves especially striking about this text from Luke is that it comes both at a time when corvids have become part of the dietary prohibitions, and this gospel appears to have been written more than any other for an explicitly Greek and more educated audience that would have had more awareness of the corvid's negative status in classical Greek traditions. Nonetheless, they still experience God's provision and deserve human curiosity and attention. In my remarks, I've demonstrated how birds, especially the corvids, take on numerous literary functions in the text of the Hebrew Bible. As winged creatures, they inhabit the physical space between and perhaps mediate between the divine and the earthly, which increases their value both for humans and beyond them. In several places, flyers display capabilities that blaze trails for humans, such as in the flood narrative and for the Syrophoenician woman in 1 Kings 17. What I have found most intriguing are the ways in which they collaborate with humans, both with Noah and also with Elijah. They demonstrate loyalty to God and to their human friends, thus exhibiting qualities that humans often reserve for themselves. Depictions of animals in the biblical text thus transgress the nature-culture dichotomy at the heart of the modern Western scientific divide between humans and other animals, providing a more complex and more holistic perspective on the value of non-human animals. Specifically, reassessing the value placed on non-human animal wisdom enhances an important source of learning in the studies of religion and science. Hopefully, as a result of my remarks, our intrigue in the ways of the wisdom of the birds has increased, offering us, humans, insight and instruction, while also going beyond mere categories of meaningfulness to humans. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a really interesting and thought-provoking talk and exploration of the place of corvids in the Hebrew Bible. Really enjoyed that. Have we got any questions? Just as a matter of detail, corvids, as mentioned by Jesus and as bringing food to Isaiah, I mean, they could have been regarded as vaguely unwelcome guests because of not being kosher animals in their own right. Is it not? Do you think it's their intelligence, or at least in part their sort of potentially arguable unwelcomeness, that makes them the recipient of this honour?
Thanks for the question. Let me just clarify quickly. The honor that you're speaking of is the honor that they end up as prohibited for food?
No, the honor of being mentioned.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I do think that their intelligence is one of the main factors. That's one of the main reasons why they show up. I actually do think that it may be their intelligence that also is the reason, in part through the Greek tradition, that lands them later on the list of non-kosher animals. I think it's really intriguing. I guess one of the reasons why I was drawn to investigate them is, first of all, why is it that they show up so often? But second of all, then in the textual tradition, so they're not originally part of the non-kosher animals. And so for us to think about, well, why over time does the text grow to include them? And I think that also then, let's say it makes things a little bit more complicated in trying to define why something is kosher or not, to use the later Jewish terminology.
I think we've got an online question.
Thank you. So the question, Peter, is: have you read Wallace's "When God Was a Bird"? What are your thoughts on God appearing as a bird in some passages, such as Jesus' baptism?
So my first answer is, ashamedly, no, I have not read When God Was a Bird. So I can't comment specifically on that. Although I suppose to put the larger question of what do we think about theomorphic appearances of God, one of course being the dove. I think we see this really throughout not only Hebrew Bible and Israelite tradition. Of course, most well known would be an Egyptian tradition. So there are, I mean, gosh, we also heard about it yesterday that in Susanna's talk. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which humans not only may not be, but may not be the best representation of different qualities for God. And so I think that both what I saw Susanna's paper doing and I would just want to add to is to say that there are aspects from non-human animals that are important for us to pay attention to, that continue to crisscross this idea that humans are so separate. I wouldn't, I don't want to completely demolish the distinction between them. But at least to make that a bit more problematic is what I see is happening there with the theomorphic, so bird-like appearance for the divine.
Got any other questions?
Hi, thank you. Really excellent paper. I have a question about the seraphim. It's a bit tangential to the main concern of the paper, but I was just interested in what you thought. You may have heard the theory that the seraphim are snakes because of the word in Hebrew and the existence of Egyptian snake iconography and the Nechoshet in the temple and things like this. And I just wondered what you thought of that idea.
Appreciate the question. I'm trying to draw back now. It's been a while since I've thought about the different representations. So Susanna, I don't know that I can really give you a good answer.
That is why I asked.
Yeah, I think in some level, I mean, we're caught between, for example, so obviously the direction I went in this paper between the Lamassu in Mesopotamian tradition and the Sphinx-like tradition, traditions, for example, in Egypt. I mean, the question of the Nehushatan, so the holding up of the snake. I'm sorry, I think I could probably drag on and fill space, but I I think the real answer is I don't have a good answer for you.
Fair enough. It was a mean question, given that it wasn't really related to your talk.
From an evolutionary point of view, birds are living dinosaurs. So would that put them in the same category as the behemoth or Leviathan? And is that theologically significant?
It's a great question, so I'm writing it down here just so that I can remember it for later as well. So from the first thought that comes to mind is that you may perhaps remember in part of my remarks about the fantastic, or from our perspective, the fantastic beings or animals, is that there seems to be less of a divide from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, ancient Israelite perspective on the distinction between what we might call a fantastic creature and animals. I think what that does is that certainly brings them closer together and allows us to think about Behemoth and Leviathan together with birds. I mean, I think if I'm understanding correctly, there seems to be a presupposition that you're making in your question that we should equate Leviathan and Behemoth in some ways with dinosaurs. I'm not sure that I'm that's at least how I'm hearing it. And I wonder if we do, if we follow that presupposition, if in some ways we can take the understanding from the Hebrew Bible text to say, oh, you know, well, maybe a way to even think about dinosaurs and thus also about birds is somewhat at least moving closer to this category of fantastic animals. So how do we think about something that's maybe not perceived right now in our experience in our experienced world? So if we can consider maybe the idea of something that's past, so how do we explain these massive bones, and perhaps put that closer to a category of the fantastic?
Thank you. Yeah, I was just trying to be inclusive, to include all those millions of species that don't get spoken of in the Bible yet existed and are all part of God's creation. And so thinking evolutionarily in terms of relatedness is a possible way of including them, even though the Bible writers obviously were ignorant of that.
Thank you for the clarification. I think that's helpful. I mean, perhaps Genesis, 1 might be a great a lens for us to think about all of the creatures as creatures created at one point in time, whether still in existence, still alive or not, as being or having been good, might be a helpful theological, ethical category to think about those in.
Any other questions? If not, I'm going to ask one. So you mentioned in your talk those lovely verses from Psalm 84, verses 3 and 4, with the sparrow and the swallow nesting in the temple. I just wonder if you think, and I'm using our modern terminology here, obviously, if the psalmist was being deliberately provocative or countercultural in mentioning that, if the ordinary Judean on the street would think that the temple was an inappropriate place to find non-human animals, other than for sacrifice.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. So we do have one comment on that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the Temple Scroll. So that being a much later text, but there. So the way that the Temple Scroll imagine. So the Temple Scrolls in some ways is rewriting the Pentateuch from its own perspective, putting it in, directly as God's words. And one of the things in its description then of the temple is that there's a way that there's something put over the temple that keeps all of the birds out. So I think that would be at least one, let's say, early voice from the history of interpretation that would go the direction of saying, yeah, we need to keep all the birds out of the temple because, we do not need, birds pooping on us when we're, or pooping in the holy places. So I think maybe a counter perspective on that would be also to think, though, about all the columbaria, which are really come about in the in the Greek period, but the use then in view of then especially so pigeons, doves, quite positively. So I don't think that can really give us a definitive answer. We don't really have anything that says, and I would go back to this, I think, yesterday in the thinking about the closeness between human and non-human animals, that there was just so much more interaction. I think we are grossed out much more quickly than the ancients. So I guess I would temper that perspective and temper the perspective of the temple scroll with that basic caveat.
Thank you. Any quick questions? If not, then I think we say, Peter, thank you very much for a really excellent and enjoyable talk. We thank Peter.
And then we're back in the next talks until 5:30.